Welcome back to Pace Immigration, paceimmigration.com. I've got them both in the room this time. I've got immigration lawyers Vince Lalonde and I've got Michael O'Rourke. Fellas, good to see you.
Hey, Sean. How's it going?
Just great. We're talking today about the top 5 reasons Canadian investors should look at the U.S. EB-5 visa. We're going to talk about what the EB-5 visa is, who it's for, how much does it cost, because everything comes with a cost, and then we'll move on to the top 5 reasons that Canadians should look at it in terms of immigrating or living in the United States. So, Michael, maybe I'll start with you really quickly. What is the EB-5 visa?
So the EB-5 visa is a special visa that allows for you to go right into permanent residence. It is based on an investment, either a direct investment or an investment in a regional center program, and it is for everybody. It's expensive. We're not going to play any games around that. The minimum investment is $800,000 for a rural or an infrastructure or a high urban unemployment area zone. But the standard luxury type of EB-5 investment is $1,050,000. So it does come with a cost. There are also administrative costs that regional centers charge, and of course legal fees to keep Vincent and me eating and the lights on. But it is something that is doable for many, many people. It's not just for the cream of the crop, the elites. Many, many people access the EB-5 program.
I was going to say, Vince, how popular is it?
It's really popular, and actually this is a time when a lot of other countries are tightening or eliminating their investor visa programs, and the EB-5 program just keeps going. It's been around since the 90s, I think, and it's gotten better and better. The government continues to make improvements, and it's the program that's very reliable. It's been there for a long time, and I was just in Taiwan last month, and really, really popular. A lot of discussion about the program. So, like compared to other international programs, it's got some real advantages. Michael mentioned the cost. Obviously, that's it's not insignificant. But one thing to keep in mind is it is an investment. It's a little bit different from some of the other investor visas or citizenship programs out there on the market. For example, the Caribbean citizenship by investment programs are really just donations. You're donating money to the government. You're not going to get it back. The same thing could be said for the Malta program, for example. Most of that cost of the program, it's roughly €1 million. Most of that is just a donation to the government. You're not going to get it back. So the EB-5 program, it is a lot of money, but at the end of the day, you're more likely than not to get your money back.
Okay, let's delve into these top 5 reasons. And as you were saying, Vince, it's different than a lot of those donation type, and this is much more of an investment. And I think those ones are more about travel with the passport, but this is about living in the United States. I mean, the EB-5 gives you access to live in one of the biggest economies and one of the most popular countries in the world.
Yeah, that's a really good point, because a lot of people will, for example, get a Caribbean passport because they want it for travel. We have a lot of our Chinese or Indian clients. Their passport's not very effective, so they get that passport so they can move around the world, but they don't really intend on living in the Caribbean. The U.S. EB-5 investor program, especially for Canadians, there are so many Canadians who are interested in living in the U.S. right now. And, obviously it's very subjective. We're talking about lifestyle advantages in the U.S. Is the U.S. a better place to live than Canada? It's, very debatable, and it depends on who you're talking to. But there are definite advantages to living in the U.S., especially for Canadians. It's close by. It's the same language. Culturally, it's very, very similar. It's so easy to get to the States. And, a lot of things that we think about in Canada right now that are disadvantages maybe are not so significant in the U.S. I was looking at some numbers for the marginal tax rate by income for Canadian provinces versus U.S. states. And this is according to the Hub. I can put a link in the show notes below. But if you're looking at $150,000 of income, annual income, which these days is not what it used to be. I mean, there was a time when we thought if your household was making $150,000 a year, you were doing quite well. Now with the cost of living in Canada, $150,000, it's like I said, it's not what it used to be. If you're living in the province of Quebec, your marginal tax rate on $150,000 of income is going to be 53%. And the lowest tax jurisdiction in Canada, Alberta, is 38%. Compare that to the US, the highest tax rate in the US is California at 33%. So I think if you talk, I've spoken to Americans, and Michael can probably back this up. People talk about California, and one of the things people mention is taxes are higher in California. Everybody thinks of California as a high tax jurisdiction in the US. Well, the highest tax jurisdiction in all of the United States is still 5% lower than the lowest tax jurisdiction in Canada by marginal tax rate if you're making $150,000 a year. So,
yeah, Michael, maybe you can speak to that a bit. I mean, you've lived in the United States. You're a licensed lawyer down there. You've, I believe, Washington, as well as you spent time in Nevada. Talk maybe about the housing.
So it depends greatly where you're at. Places that have had the California effect, and I'm not going to use the nasty word that everybody talks about, but so for instance, Seattle, where I lived last in the US, housing used to be somewhat affordable, and then quite a bit of movement up from the Bay Area in California raised the prices greatly. But if you go to other areas of the state, it's much more affordable. Nevada is still quite affordable. Oregon, again, generally affordable, but it's had that California effect. It really depends on where you go. The U.S. is such a vast country, and you've got hundreds and hundreds of cities that are well developed, unlike Canada, where you have a few major cities and then large or small towns. Generally, I found tax rates were lower, housing was lower, your money went further.
Yeah, Vince, I put up here on the screen, I put up a shot of New York. There's Manhattan right there, the hustle and bustle of the big city. One thing that's always made me jealous of the United States is they have so much diversity in terms of geography and places to go. Because if you like the big city, you can live in Manhattan. If you like, I put the beach there at Tampa. If you like a relatively empty beach, you can go there. There's all kinds of things to do in the United States and all kinds of weather.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I mean, some people love the weather in Canada. I don't know who, but I'm sure there are some people who like the Canadian weather. But if you love Canadian weather, you can live in Minnesota.
That's right.
You can live in Montana. But if you like the beach, you can live in Florida or California. So there's so much, and I think that really applies to what Michael was talking about as well in terms of the cost of living. Like Canada right now, it doesn't seem like there's any escape from the high cost of living, the high cost of housing right now. Whether you're in Toronto or Vancouver or Calgary, you just can't escape from it. Whereas the US, there are still places where housing is really cheap. Even a city like, I was looking at some numbers from Numbeo, comparing the cost of living, and the price per square foot to buy a condo in the city center in Chicago is $462 per square foot. In Toronto, it's $1,263 per square foot. So it's almost 3 times the price of Chicago. And we kind of think of Toronto and Chicago as similar cities in terms of geography and size. They're both on the Great Lakes or whatever. So there are definitely cheap options. And like I said, that's the great thing about the US is you have those options. You can live somewhere more expensive that's warmer. You can live somewhere that's a lot cheaper. Some great cities, St. Louis, Pittsburgh, Chicago, are still relatively affordable. So, you just have those options that maybe we don't have so much in Canada, just because it's a smaller country in terms of its population. And then also keep in mind that the salaries are going to be higher in the US as well. I looked at the average monthly net salary after tax, again, comparing Toronto and Chicago. Toronto's at $4,939 monthly, whereas Chicago is $6,753 monthly. So, your taxes are lower, your cost of housing is lower, and your potential salary could be higher as well. So, when we talk about taxes, it's one thing if you're talking about your own salary and, taxes are high in Canada. I might not take home as much money at the end of the month. But if you're talking about business people, higher tax rates could be, a matter of life and death for your business. If you're paying more in taxes, your business might not be able to survive. So I think especially for business people, these lower costs, lower taxes make a real difference.
Okay, let's move on to point number 2 here. We're carrying on basically from taxes and money and that kind of talk to investment, which is what the EB-5 is supposed to be about. So Vince, maybe tee off on the investment, and you have here as point number 1 that it's flexible. Yeah,
so I think that, like, again, we're talking about the lifestyle advantages of living in the U.S. Some people are thinking, well, why do I need to do EB-5? Why can't I just go and live in the U.S.? Well, a lot of people don't really realize you can't just pick up and go live in the U.S. You need to have a visa to live there. And, so now we're talking about the best way to live in the U.S. If you actually want to live, take advantage of these items that we're talking about. The EB-5 program is a great option. Michael talked a little bit about what it is at the beginning, but I just wanted to emphasize that it's a lot more flexible and a lot safer than it used to be. First of all,
what do you have here with the EB-5 Reform and Integrity Act, Vince? I haven't actually talked about that with you before.
Yeah, so basically the EB-5 Reform and Integrity Act came in I believe 2022, and it's revitalized the EB-5 Regional Center program with better protections, quicker processing, and new visa set-aside categories without backlogs. So there's a number of advantages, but for me, the biggest advantage of the Integrity Act is the fact that the EB-5 program is a lot safer than it used to be. There's a lot more scrutiny of the projects. It's very transparent right now. If you want to invest in the EB-5 program, I think there's 712 approved regional centers or approved projects the last time I checked. So you have so much option and there's so much transparency that really there's a lot of flexibility in terms of what you're investing in. And the investments, like I said, it's a lot safer than it used to be. 10, 15 years ago, there were horror stories about people investing in a project and losing their money. You don't hear about that as much anymore. You don't hear about it at all anymore. The EB-5 program has become a lot safer, I think, than it used to be since they brought in this act in 2022. And, chances are that, you can't guarantee, and actually that's part of the program, you can't guarantee that applicants are going to get their money back. But the chances are very, very good, especially since you can go in and do the research yourself and find one of these 712 projects that's suitable for you.
Michael, let's just talk about money for one quick second. People have to be able to prove where their money came from, and they have to be transparent on their end too, right?
Oh, yeah. And that's a large part of what we do is we make sure that we can trace the funds and show where they originated and that they're not tainted through like drug trafficking or money laundering or anything like that. Yes, that is a large part of the diligence that we perform before we file an application for EB-5.
Yeah, the EB-5 is not something it's not a visitor visa, right? You're not filling that out on your own on the kitchen table and filing that. I mean, you're going to need some help with this.
Yeah, I wouldn't do that. It is complex and many moving parts.
Okay, let's carry on to number 3, green card advantages, because that's ultimately what we're talking about here is the green card via the EB-5. Michael, you talk all the time about the alphabet soup of visas that people can use to try and go and live in the United States. The EB-5 trumps them all. Why?
Well, it isn't a temporary program or a temporary status. It takes you right into a green card setting. You can get work authorization while you're waiting for it if you file for an adjustment of status within the US, but you don't necessarily have to have, say, an L1 or an H1B or a TN or any of those work visas to take advantage of the EB-5. You can stay in your home country, here, Canada, or if you're able to be in the U.S. In some sort of immigration status, you can apply for it there as well. But you don't have to go through the rigmarole of constantly finding your status, keeping your status, renewing your status, and then hoping that you can qualify for a green card program.
Right.
Basically, you're buying your way in.
Right. And I've got down here no restrictions on the ownership of property. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so some jurisdictions have put foreign ownership restrictions on property. As a U.S. legal permanent resident, an LPR, you are like any other U.S. person and can own property anywhere. Same with employment. There's no restriction on you working for either yourself or for an employer once you have a green card.
Excellent. Vince, if you have someone come to you and they want to live and work in the United States, I mean, I'm guessing maybe one of your questions would be, well, you know, how much money do you have? I mean, if someone is well off, maybe you would go the EB-5 route as opposed to something that they were considering.
Yeah, and like, what do you want to do there? Because not everybody's, I mean, some people think, well, I want to go down to the US and work. Well, it's not so easy. If you're getting status in the US based on employment, then you need a specific visa for that. Not only is that visa temporary in nature, the H-1B or whatever the visa happens to be, you have to renew it every few years, and your employment is restricted. You can't go and work anywhere you want to. Whereas if you have a green card, then you know, there's no restriction on employment. There's no restriction on ownership of property. So some of the advantages, the lifestyle advantages of living in the US that we were talking about in the last slide, you can really only take advantage of some of those things if you have that green card, really.
Right.
So, yeah, so you're right. You ask them what they want to do there. And a lot of people want to do business. A lot of the Canadians that I'm talking to who want to go to the US, they want to do business there. They want to invest in the US. And this is a great option because, you know, like I think we'll probably talk about in a bit, even if you want to do business in the US under one of the visa categories for business people, L1, et cetera, then there are restrictions and there are, you know, limitations on that type of residency as well that you don't have if you have a green card.
Right. Let's move on to those now then. So we've got here basically green card advantages continued, Michael. No required return to Canada, and also the L1 stuff that Vince was talking about.
Yeah, exactly. So if you have your typical intercompany transfer who has a business in Canada and then sets up a business in the United States, you can transfer employees back and forth. For multinational managers, there is a path to green card, but from setting up the business, getting the L1, and then getting into the green card process for a multinational manager, you're going to look at probably 4 years easily, where with EB-5 right now, we're seeing approvals as fast as 8 months for some of the rural projects, and typically more like a year to a year and a half. You can also bring your family, which I don't think we've touched on yet, but the permanent residence applies not just to the investor, but to the investor's family, spouse, and dependent children.
Yeah, that's a big one because the other visas, man, it's a struggle, isn't it, to provide for your family, to bring them over, to get them to have some work for themselves, etc.
Exactly. For instance, since everybody coming in over on an EB-5 would be able to work like any other American permanent resident or citizen on certain visas, for instance, the F1, which is the typical study visa, there's no working allowed, and the spouses can't work. For the L1, for instance, children can't work. Not that you necessarily want to put your children to work, but even having things like a paper route could theoretically violate the terms of a visa. So it gives you more flexibility, and you don't have to look over your shoulder to see, okay, when does status expire? When do I have to plan to renew it? And what happens if USCIS says no when I try and renew it? It just gives more stability.
It sounds like it, yeah. So Vince, you've got a high net worth investor who wants to go to the United States. but he's asking about his wife and kids. Who does that apply to? Is it immediate family can also get permanent residency?
Yeah, so if you're applying for a green card under the EB-5 program, you can bring your dependents, so your spouse and your children under 21 and under, I believe. So yeah, so and that's a really important point. What I've seen a lot lately is Canadians who go and get a place in Florida or get a place in Arizona, and they're snowbirds. They're going down there and kind of semi-retired in the States, spending more and more time down there. I feel like I'm seeing that more and more, this kind of semi-retirement arrangement, because so many people are working online, so people will go and maybe they're in their 50s and they're starting to spend more time in the US, and then their kids start to go visit them in the US, and the kids want to stay and live in the US as well and take advantage of maybe the education in the US, or the higher salaries in the US. And if you're just a snowbird, you can't really take advantage of, you can't really bring your kids down. But if you're applying for permanent residence under the EB-5 program, then of course you can bring your dependents with you as well. So it's a huge advantage, really. And it's something that I think people don't think about right away. Sometimes they don't think about it until they're actually starting to spend more time down there. And then the kids go down and visit them, and the kids are like, hey, Mom, I want to live here too.
Right. Okay, Michael, moving on to point 5, we have faster path to green card than employment or marriage-based routes. That's big. I mean, you mentioned some of that other stuff taking, years and years, like 3+ years, whereas this, you said, could take sometimes, 8 months to a year and a half.
Exactly. So take your typical marriage-based route. One, if you have a Canadian spouse already, they're probably not going to want you to do the marriage to a U.S. citizen for you to get the green card and leave them in the cold in Canada. So that's probably out for quite a few people. But a typical marriage-based case is usually going to take about 2.5 years to wrap up and result in a green card, as long as there are no inadmissibilities. An employment-based case, in the best scenario, is usually going to take about 3 to 3.5. But if you're in an employment category that has a backlog, especially if you're an Indian national or a Chinese national, you can be looking at a decade, 15 years even, to get your green card. It is not uncommon to hear about EB-5, H-1B visa holders from India who are in their 12th or 14th year of H-1B while they're waiting in that incredible backlog. With EB-5, especially investments in infrastructure or rural projects, with the set-asides, there's a 20% visa set-aside. Even those nationalities that typically experience massive delays getting into the green card posture move faster. For non-backlogged nationalities, it generally is taking about a year to a year and a half from start to finish with the EB-5 process. And that, I think, is probably the fastest way now to get into green card status.
Vince, do Canadians have a leg up on this at all?
Definitely. I mean, first of all, you're not going to, there are restrictions on the number of applicants from various countries around the world. We're never going to hit the caps that we have for, like Canadians. There'll never be enough people applying under the EB-5 program to reach the cap. So there's no risk of backlogs really building up. But also, I think just for Canadians in general, the paperwork is going to be a lot more accepted by immigration authorities in the U.S. than maybe paperwork from other jurisdictions. Your proof of assets, your proof of income, it's considered a lot more reliable, and that's probably going to help speed things up and ensure that you get your visa at the end of the day. I know from working in immigration for a number of years that not all immigrants are created equal, unfortunately. So yeah, there's definitely a little bit of a different treatment for Canadians compared to people from some countries where you tend to see a little bit more fraud in the paperwork, or whether it, people that don't necessarily claim all their income to tax authorities. So yeah, it's definitely going to be a little bit quicker, I think, and a little bit easier. And especially now that a lot of the approval for an EB-5 application takes place even before you submit your application, because they have that, maybe Michael can speak a little bit to that, but they have that pre-approval process now, where you don't have to prove that your investment is meeting all the requirements of the program every time you submit a new application for a new applicant. A lot of that approval of the project or review of the project is done beforehand.
Yeah, Michael, pre-approval, what about that?
Yeah, so with the new RIA law, regional centers have to go through a process with USCIS where they disclose everything related to the financial side of the investment that's proposed. They have a securities offering, basically, that they provide to USCIS, and it shows also the amount of jobs that the project creates, because job creation is a very big factor within EB-5. Now, once they submit that to USCIS, they get something called a 956F approval, because of course, as immigration lawyers, we can only talk in numbers and letters, but they get this pre-approval, and then that allows for the investor to file a petition to show an investment in that project. So you don't have to prove each and every time that the jobs have been created and that the funds are invested. So it makes the processing of EB-5 applications much, much faster.
Great stuff, gentlemen. I think that's a pretty comprehensive look at some of the key points for why Canadian investors and high net worth individuals should have a look at the EB-5 if they're interested in staying in the United States almost for any amount of time, to be honest. I mean, because it gives them a lot of flexibility. Michael, one question I did have about the green card, because permanent residency does have residency requirements. Is that the same with green card that you get with the EB-5? You still have to meet those requirements?
Yes. So once you get a green card, and with the EB-5 program, you get a conditional green card for 2 years, that then you have to go and remove the conditions. But like any other legal permanent resident, you have an obligation to file taxes with Uncle Sam, and you have an obligation to maintain your intent to make the United States your home. So that's shown by physical presence. If you leave, say, more than 6 months, then they can question whether you still have that intent to be a permanent resident. So once you get the green card via EB-5 or any other green card, honestly, you have to start making the US your home. You can still travel, but talk to a lawyer if you're planning on leaving the US for more than 6 months, and definitely if you're going to leave for more than a year, because there are ways that we can insulate your intent to preserve your intent for a couple of years, but you have to do it in advance.
Excellent. Vince, any closing comments?
Yeah, I was going to say it's a lot easier to meet that requirement if you're in Canada than it is if you're in China or the Far East or India or something. I don't know what this statistic is, but it's like 90% of Canadians live within 200 kilometers of the U.S. border. So it doesn't take much to go over and make a trip to the U.S. every once in a while and maintain your intention to live in the U.S.
Okay. Gentlemen, thanks very much for this. Top 5 reasons Canadian investors should look at the U.S. EB-5 visa. Any questions? Of course, their emails are right here on the screen and in the show notes. Gentlemen, we'll see you next time.
Thanks, Sean.
Thanks, Sean.